Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone and welcome to Work in Progress, the Personal Productivity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode. I'm Dina Sargent, and I'm your host for the show today. Now, you often hear the term problem solving in conversations, resumes, and career expectations. Now, most of us easily add it into our resumes as our list of skill sets that can set us apart from everyone else. However, sometimes without even knowing what it could possibly mean, I hate to admit that I am one of those people. Today, we're going to aim to define what it is and how it allows us to be productive in our work performance, school life, and everyday situations. Now, I'm not going to be talking about this alone. I have got Robert McLean joining me today. He has worked with companies and exposed to the skill of problem solving. One company in particular was McKinsey Management Consulting Firm. Now, how are you going today, Robert?
Very well, thank you, Dina.
I'm very happy to come and talk to you today and understand what problem solving is. Like I said, I hate to admit it, but I am that one person that does not know what it means and does not know how it can possibly apply to everyday life that we're going through.
Well, we strike problem solving in so many areas of our lives. For example, in our family, one of the questions we've been dealing with is, should we put solar panels on the roof? Mm-hmm. There's a cost. There's some revenue that comes through. There's an impact on your carbon footprint. And all those things have got to be taken into account. And particularly, should I do it now or should I do it later? Mm-hmm. And we would argue, and we show in Bulletproof Problem Solving that this is the kind of problem that can be successfully addressed with our problem solving approach. Then when you're working in a company, there's a whole lot of issues about new products and innovation. You might be losing market share. What are the root causes that explain that? And once again, that lends itself to problem solving. Mm-hmm. And we talk in the book about how some global problems or societal problems like the spread of HIV in India, mm-hmm. Or the spread of obesity globally, you can gain insight in how problems like that can be tackled mm-hmm. With a systematic process.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've had a chance to get to talk to you a little bit before we started recording and get to know you a little bit more. Before we get into the topic, we love to start off with a little get to know you and get to understand a little bit more into your everyday life and sort of what your interests are. So when I say these different topics, just say the first thing that sort of comes to your mind. The first one is a favorite book of yours.
It's a book few readers would have heard of. It's a book entitled Olive Cotton, who was one of Australia's finest photographers. Mm-hmm. Her career started in the 20s and 30s, and then she had a period where she didn't photograph for almost 50 years, and then came into prominence again towards the end of her life. Mm-hmm. Why do I like a book like that? Well, I love her work. She's done some extraordinarily artistic photography. And it's given me an understanding of the person behind it and the life that she led.
Mm-hmm. Wow, it's amazing that a photographer can sort of inspire a whole lot of different ways of understanding the world and different ways of looking into its scope into what they see.
Indeed.
The next one is a favorite movie of yours.
Oh, I'm a soapy. I would say Dr. Zhivago.
Okay, I can understand that. I've seen it
being on the train and looking at the snow outside and a beautiful love affair.
Yeah. Oh, that is a really nice way. It's a really idealistic life way of living as well. The next one is a favorite podcast.
I love economic podcasts. So Econ Talk is one that I listen to regularly, and that mainly has economists being interviewed. And another is Tyler Cowen's program, and he's another professor of economics. And whenever I'm out walking, I have a podcast on. And if it isn't one of those two, it's The Economist.
Okay, I've seen The Economist. I really like listening to him. I really like listening to the whole idea of it as well. So it's probably the only way you can get me interested in economy and understanding it a little bit more. So this sort of ties in really well to the next phase, which is the famous role model that you have.
Is there a role model that I had?
Yes.
Yes, an Australian by the name of Sir Roderick Carnegie.
Okay.
He was the leader of Consig Rio Tinto, and prior to that he had headed McKinsey. And I got to know Rod, and I loved his intelligence. I loved his concern for Australia and its growth, and the capability that we had as a people in the modern world. Now, there's many other people that affect your life, but at a very young age, I looked up to Rod and admired his accomplishments enormously.
So how has he inspired what you're doing today in sort of helping the world understand the situations?
Well, at McKinsey, Rod was known as being an absolutely fearless problem solver. And there were stories about how the modern corporation is organised around business units.
Okay.
And Rod was leading that work with a client in the US. And at first there was resistance to what he was proposing, but in the end they agreed to it, reorganised the company, and the world followed with this organising around business units. So Rod was a great problem solver, is a great problem solver, and of course a role model for people like myself.
And this really goes into the whole idea of what we're here to talk about today, and talk about problem solving, and talk about productivity as well. Like, the whole show is based around productivity. So before we get started, we'd love to know, how would you personally define what productivity is?
My definition of productivity would be the pretty standard one of economists, that it's the output divided by the hours that are worked. What we know, though, is that output isn't standardised, isn't the same, and in a lot of areas, what I've come over time to learn to do is to try to work smart, and that means focus on the right problem or the real problem, and devote the most productive hours to it, and that way your productivity is going to be high.
So what do you think people get wrong when it comes to understanding productivity and how you see productivity?
Well, the nature of work today is that most people work in teams, and productivity is determined not so much by the productivity of an individual person, but the productivity of the team itself. So that means that they need to have work plans, they need to have objectives, they need to have time frames, and they need to be able to sort out differences in points of view. And once you go down that path, it's not just a simple matter of, there are some areas. I was with a software company this morning that I'm involved in, and, they were having a coding camp. And you can all, I think the listeners can appreciate, well, if you've got a coding camp, you could come up with a measure of productivity, which is like how many lines of code got written, in a day or an hour. But so much of what we do in modern work involves trade-offs, involves teams, differences in points of view. And it more is more in the nature of problem solving, than just a simple metric of output per hour or lines of code. So not an easy measure, to come up with.
No, I think especially when it comes to, I know that everyone has a different definition as to what productivity is to them. And hearing it, you always see it's being productive, it's making use of your time, it's understanding that there's always something to do, there's always something that you could be doing. Like for example, the phrase that I always get at home, that you could be more productive, you can do something more productive with your day, and understand. And sometimes it's being the lack of productivity that goes along is sort of what stops everyone in like either co-workers or family situations from the cogs to stop working. I always see it as sort of the cog situation where you have one cog that stops working, then all the other cogs sort of stop working, so a machine can't function properly.
Right.
And it's really interesting because the whole idea of it being seen as a machine is sort of how everyone involved in the situation or in the problem is just getting solved. If one person isn't able to work, or one person isn't working properly or to their best capability of getting the task done, then it's not seen as being productive. It's not seen as the whole machine running effectively.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to the definition I gave of productivity before, of output divided by hours, I think we spend a lot of time on the denominator, the hours, not much time on the numerator. And that's where problem solving comes into play, because you can get output, but if you worked on the wrong problem, or you didn't prioritise well, you're not going to get the outcome that you potentially could get. Whereas I think we've got on the denominator, I think, as you say, there's a lot of tricks of the trade, using your productive hours well. I'm a morning person. I do my best work, from between 6 o'clock and noon or 1 o'clock.
Okay.
My wife, on the other hand, is an afternoon person. She writes between 1 and 6 o'clock, and that's the time when she's at her most productive. So I think we've learned how to do those things, but what we haven't learned enough about is how you can change the world and change the workplace you've got by thinking more about problem solving and output. And can I give an example?
Yes, go for it.
There's an example we talk about in our new book, The Imperfectionists. Elon Musk, who is famous for some quite outrageous things or demanding things, he's been relentlessly trying to lower the cost of getting into space with his SpaceX venture.
Yeah.
And one of the things he was concerned about was that the avionics, the computer on board SpaceX, cost about $10 million. And so he wanted to dramatically lower the cost of avionics. He interviewed a NASA engineer by the name of Kevin Watson, and he said, I've got a task for you. I want you to build me a $10,000 computer for SpaceX. And Kevin Watson gulped and took it all in and said, so you're asking me to reduce the cost of the avionics by 99%. And Musk said yes in a year. Okay. And he did. But that, to my mind, is an example of what we see in problem solving, where you got to focus on the numerator as well, what can be and how the world can be different and a better place when you solve a problem.
Yeah. So, for example, the numerator that you're talking about, what could that be to counter the denominator? So what could the numerator that you're talking about, in terms of an example, what could the numerator do to sort of elevate or help the?
Well, I think in that case, it was really asking an audacious or an outrageous question about the cost reduction potential.
Okay.
So the end result was that Musk got a computer for $10,000. So that we would call that a problem-solving result.
Yeah.
And it was done in a period of time that nobody ever thought was possible.
Oh, it's amazing that they were able to ever complete that and ever go through that task.
Let me give another example, perhaps to illustrate this. A couple of my colleagues at McKinsey were working with the Federal Reserve of San Francisco on whether they could improve productivity in counting money,
Okay.
notes and coin.
Yeah.
And they were trying to think of different ways to go about it. And then one of my colleagues, Don Waters, said, "Why don't we weigh the money? Why don't we weigh the money instead of counting it?"
Mm-hmm.
And they said, "Well, how would we know if it was any better or not?" So they said, "Well, we can just run some experiments. We can see what errors there are when we weigh money, and we can see what errors there are when we count it." And what they found, and they had the leadership of the Federal Reserve watching while they did this experiment, this count, and they showed that there were actually far more errors in physically counting the money than just weighing it and coming up with an estimate of how much money was there.
Wow.
So that, again, is a problem-solving output, where it was compared to an alternative. There was significantly less errors in this quite radical approach. But you can see where big ideas come into play, and that's what I meant before when I said one of the first things is to think a bit more about the numerator as well as the denominator. It's not to say the denominator's not important, but we're all running around with lists and to-dos and priorities and often not thinking about what could be.
No, that's a really good way because it ties in very nicely to problem solving and discussing it a little bit more. How would you personally define what it is? And this is a question that I'm personally interested in knowing because I have no clue as to what problem solving actually is a set definition for. So how would you personally define what it is?
Well, you only have a problem when you have alternatives and consequences. And you might also say some uncertainty about them. If there was nothing to be traded off or resolved around questions I gave before, like HIV in India or the solar panels on my roof, there would be an element of certainty and confidence that meant you didn't need to spend time looking at the alternatives. So I'm not much of a person for sort of games and puzzles, and they're reasonably deterministic. So I don't think of those as fitting into this category of having real choices with consequences, with the kind of problems that I'm talking about in business and society.
Okay, so what kind of problems would you usually sort of focus on? If not the games and puzzles, what kind of areas would you like to strengthen your skill set?
Well, we're in Bulletproof Problem Solving and the Imperfectionists, we take quite a wide range of problems that we've seen successfully addressed. And, I touched on one a little while back of that obesity is something that we talked about, and it's a difficult subject to talk about. But nevertheless, we thought, well, how might we, with our problem-solving capability, think about this? And so we started off with very simple approaches of calories in and calories out, and did that really explain things across countries? And were there countries where they seemed to have policies that meant that they had less obesity than others? And then we started to say, well, there's big differences between countries like the US and Japan in terms of obesity. But when you come to the US itself, there's some enormous differences within cities in the United States. But what we started to observe there was that the cities that had very, very high levels of obesity were ones that had low socioeconomic status. And so we started to go down a track where we thought, well, maybe these things ought to be taken into account more in policy. So it's not just a health policy, but may relate to broader things in society. And we took that a little further with some work that was done in Australia recently on child obesity, and the team drew an extraordinary conclusion that when they looked at socioeconomic status, and came up with the conclusion that until the age of 8, whether or not a child obese was primarily linked to the parents' body mass index, and in particular that of the mother, whether the mother had Year 12 education.
Okay.
So this is not the end of the story, but problem solving takes you down paths, and that work has been written up, and it to some extent reframes a health issue as an education issue and a socioeconomic status issue. So we use this expression that complex problems don't give up their secrets easily, and that's why you've got to have a systematic process that allows you to bring different lenses to a problem, experiment, draw on all kinds of capability, not just the people on your own team and that are in your own team room, to have these answers that are going to stand scrutiny and that are going to have a big impact on the world.
And so how does the whole idea, a whole philosophy regarding problem solving, how does that influence an individual's personal productivity?
The most likely thing that you're going to feel once you've gone through a systematic process of defining the problem, breaking it down into component parts, setting some priorities in what you've got to do first, and then second, putting a work plan together that assigns responsibilities to team members, doing the analysis, which may be simple heuristics, or it might be complex models or scenarios, and then doing the synthesis where, as a team, you pull together the findings, and then finally, where you put your recommendations for action to whoever the decision maker is. And we would argue that going through that process means it's most likely that you will have defined the problem well, and so there's less risk that you were working on the wrong problem. And then if you've carefully brought different lenses to a problem or broken it down in ways that give you a lot of insight about the problem, then again you've reduced the risk that you didn't just implement what the boss said he thought was the problem, or what the team did this last week or last year, but that you've worked together with your colleagues and you've probed it, you've tested it, and you've come away with conviction that your conclusions and your recommendations make sense given the way you've defined the problem and the resources you've put to it.
So it's not so much about really debating your reason, it's more understanding what the situation is and how it needs to be solved.
Well, we see problem solving as a team sport.
Okay.
And it's one where so much of problem solving before COVID, and we're learning to do it post-COVID, that you did in team rooms with diverse teams, with teams that brought different skills and perspectives together.
Yep.
So you may have somebody with a business background, you may have someone with a stats or an IT background, depending on what the issue is. But you've actually got to go through that process of arguing the toss about why you think the problem is X or why you think the problem is Y, and convincing your teammates that you have defined the issues correctly, and that you've got a plan that makes sense to solve the problem, and then of course be able to defend your conclusions, because ultimately you're going to have to present them to higher level management or a board to get sign off on the action you're proposing. And at every step of the way there, my view is just one view, and I've got to be convinced. I've got to be able to convince you and the rest of the team, and you've got to do the same. where you reach a view that, yes, this is the team's view.
And how, in sort of a way when it comes to a group setting, I know that everyone has a different way of explaining their side and sort of determining what side is the correct side. There are some personalities there that are very, very easily to buckle down and to just choose a side.
Yeah.
How do you have the strength to sort of keep arguing your side and keep seeing the different ways that you can sort of state your case and be right in it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there's a lot of tricks of the trade, that we've used and that we've seen used. So, for example, one thing we'll do is go around the room and and ask for everybody's views. But we'll start with the most junior people.
Okay.
So their views get heard and don't get drowned out by more senior people. Another device we use is when we have defined the issues and put together a logic tree and put that up on a whiteboard, we'll allocate everybody some sticky notes and they get 100 points and they get to vote for the issues that they think are the most important issues that we should be working on. And so we tally up the votes reflecting what the groups feel. So they're both ways of reducing the impact of seniority, or just the whole sense of, the boss thinks this is the problem and therefore that's what we're going to have to work on.
And so what are some of the skill sets that make an individual a good problem solver?
We argue that good problem solvers are made, not born. So we don't feel that this is just the domain of philosophers, or of people who have learnt logic. They're fairly simple propositions, but yes, of course, you do have to use either inductive or deductive reasoning, and it helps to know a little bit about them. But my experience at McKinsey was that we brought in such a diversity of people, from people who had English literature backgrounds to economics, music, philosophy, PhDs in nuclear physics, and they all had to work in teams and learn to work with each other. So you come away just saying a structured process can allow teams to build their capability, and it doesn't really matter greatly, whether they come from a particular discipline or not.
And why is it so? I know in a lot of settings, it's very difficult to get along with some people that you work with and some group members. Why do you think it's a difficult thing to sort of get along with people that you work with?
I think we're all we're all different, of course, but the experiences that I've had have mostly been that we're on the same page as a team. That we have a common goal, which is to we're contracted by or we've got an agreement by a client that we're going to achieve some results for them in a certain period of time, and we're highly motivated to serve that client superbly well. So you have some great unifying things, but we also had a culture in McKinsey, and I believe that's true to this day, that says, we want to focus on what's right rather than who's right. We want to have, strong conviction from the facts and the analysis that we look at. So yes, those things are going to be debated and argued. Today, we think it's getting harder and harder just for facts to carry the day. And we're learning a lot more about how you argue in terms of frames and values in order to get somebody to take an action that is needed. But I think there's plenty of evidence to show that people do work well in teams and really overcome their personal differences with the objectives they have together.
And what are some of the personality traits that need to take place in order for someone to really excel at problem solving?
Well, I was asked this question when we launched the book a few years ago, and the person asking the question said, "Rob, it struck me that you and so many of the people that I work with were intensely curious, and we think curiosity is quite important, because that means you're open to new ideas, and you're not just going to run with something that has been done before." I think having a tolerance for ambiguity, and recognising that very few things these days are certain, and you've got to accept the fact that you've got to find a way forward, even though it's not 100% clear, and that you can make mistakes. The word that gets used a lot these days is empathy, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And there's no question that people who became successful at McKinsey had empathy and built great client relationships. But there's also something about wanting to see change and wanting to see things get done. We don't think good problem solvers are just happy with an elegant answer. They want to see action.
Yeah.
They want to see the recommendations that have been put together come into play and have impact in the world the way they'd like them to.
And it's really interesting because we talk about logic, and we talk about logic being attached to problem solving. How much of problem solving is logical?
Well, wouldn't it sound funny if you flipped it around and said how much of problem solving is illogical?
Okay, let's try that question then.
And I don't know how to work in that world. But if I just give you an illustration, one of the things that during COVID that I did, because I love doing logic trees and thinking about problems, and I gave myself the problem after the 2019-20 bushfires in New South Wales, a little challenge to say, what was going on? What happened? Why did we have such extraordinary loss of property, lives, over 1 billion animals during those fires? And so I started doing what I tend to do, is to say, how would I break this problem down? Well, I'd think about the incidence of the fires, and I'd talk about the severity of the fires. And if I looked at the severity, I would try and understand where the fires occurred, how they were started, and how they spread. And when I started asking myself those questions, it took me to understand that there were a class of fires called mega fires, and there were about a dozen of them that each burnt out over 250,000 hectares. Now, those mega fires were 1% of the fires in 2019-20, but they accounted for over 50% of the damage that occurred. So I think you can see what I'm doing here. I'm following a logic tree, and I'm trying to say, well, where did these fires occur? Well, they occurred deep in national parks. How did they get started? They got started by lightning strikes. How did they spread? Very rapidly, because there was no ability for access, by fire brigades and so forth. And we had very few of those water bombers available at that time. So this is really almost the only way I know to break apart a complex problem, which is to keep asking these why questions. And what happened here, and where did it happen, and then pursue the logic that allows as I said earlier, even the most complex problems to give up their secrets.
Mm-hmm. And how, in a sense of talking about the logic that sort of takes place in that, is there a place that emotion fits in there as well, or is it purely logical?
You immediately made me think about a story I mentioned a little earlier about the spread of HIV in India.
Mm-hmm.
And a former colleague of mine, Ashok Alexander, joined the Gates Foundation and worked on this issue of the spread of HIV. And when Ashok first got involved, the foundation was following an epidemiological approach to how the HIV was being spread. And they were focused on long-distance truck stops and what they called men on the move in uniform who were responsible for transmitting the virus.
Okay.
Ashok took a totally different approach. He went to hundreds of villages and met sex workers who were mainly women and tried to understand what was going on. And what he learned with just extraordinary emotion and sadness and a whole lot of other and joy with it was that these women were facing domestic violence, and that one of the things that had to stop was the domestic violence. And he and the communities came up with a model that alerted the community to where these situations were, where women were being threatened with violence. And you read Ashok's book, which is a very, very moving book, but here's, a hardcore McKinsey problem solver working with the Gates Foundation with an extraordinary amount of emotion of what was happening in the lives of these women. And the good part of the story is that in about 18 months, what was called the Avahan solution was rolled out to a huge number of communities in India, and it's believed to have stopped the spread of HIV.
Wow. It's amazing just how much problem solving, the skill set and the logic really fits in with the emotional tie of the situation, and just how much it does really help in sort of solving the spread of HIV and sort of understanding the sociological way that it takes place. Now, talking a little bit more about how emotion fits into it, what are your thoughts on problem solving versus the whole idea of overthinking?
I like that question because we are, my co-author Charles Conn and myself, are very much people who love to see, we have a bias for action.
Okay.
And so we don't care. At times we clearly see overthinking being just another way of risk aversion. But there's also times when there's a need for so-called overthinking, and sometimes overthinking is used as a put down to let's do what I've said you should do, or let's not debate this, and in that case that's unfair. The example I just gave of Avahan with Ashok Alexander. Ashok spent about a year visiting, hundreds of communities before they came up with the plan for how they would deal with HIV. He could have been accused of overthinking, but that actually turned out to be a good way of getting the results. Complex problems typically require using multiple lenses on them, looking at them this way, looking at them that way. And that often takes time and involves costs. So I think while I have a bias for action, I'd say that there are cases when overthinking is not a bad thing.
And so is it possible that a good problem solver might also be a heavy overthinker then?
There are if you're on a team, as you mostly are, and if every situation you come across you're being viewed as overthinking, well, probably you are. I've just tried to give a sense that there's two sides to the coin. Problem solvers are interested in action and seeing things, getting things done. And one of the things that runs in the way of that is risk aversion. But there's also the nature of the problems we face now. We really want bold hypotheses. We want audacious questions being asked. We want different lenses to be used on a problem. We want experiments to occur. And what's changed is that so many of the environments that you're doing problem solving in have high uncertainty. Now, if you're very clear about your sales next year, or what climate change is going to do next year, then you probably don't have to there's not much risk of overthinking. But when the way forward is not clear, because of technology change or disruption in your industry or any number of external shocks, you've usually got to think them through before you take big action. And that's where in our next book we talk a lot about taking small steps, experimenting, finding your way, even when the road ahead is not very clear.
And to what extent can overthinking be negatively impacting your problem-solving skills?
Well, as I mentioned, through risk aversion, I see that. And then, of course, it may just be if things don't pan out successfully, it's a waste of time and resources.
Because I relate to that question very deeply, because I am a deep overthinker. And sometimes it really, with situations that sort of come about in life or in the career method, I tend to overthink, and that pretty much stops the whole idea of how to solve a problem and how to deal with the situation.
What I would encourage you to do is use a little technique that when you hear somebody argue the case for something with the hypothesis, one of the little tricks of the trade we use is to say, what do you have to believe for that to be true? Where you tease out what the assumptions are, the critical assumptions, and if they were all able to tick them off, you would then move forward. So overthinking doesn't have to happen in a vacuum, or it just doesn't need to be something that you just mull. You can continue. I wouldn't recommend that you just keep mulling stuff over. You've got to keep running numbers. You've got to keep putting arguments in your head, asking yourself that question: what do I have to believe for this to be true? And that's productive time.
No, that is a very good question. I kept asking myself that as you were speaking. I'm like, what do I have to believe? Do you believe that problem solving should be a skill present on an individual CV or even a resume?
I'd like it to be, because I have a vested interest in it. And so, for example, we have an online course in problem solving with Go One. And what we've started to notice is that people who complete the course are showing this certificate on LinkedIn. We're talking with our publisher in the US, and they're talking a lot about micro-credentials, that besides courses that people do at university, they're also wanting to do problem solving, Six Sigma, Python, where they are able to demonstrate that they've done these courses extra curricular, but they round out the resume, as they say.
No, because it's very interesting, especially with this sort of topic when it comes to resumes and CVs, because I know a lot of people my ages, and I know a lot of my friends who add that into their resume and aren't really sure if what they define problem solving skill set is actually something that they are deemed to be adding onto the resume?
I don't think there's any harm, but at the end of the day, what always happened at McKinsey was that when people were being interviewed, you would test them for their problem solving, and that happens in so much of knowledge work and analytical work today. So even though you've got it on your resume, you're going to be tested with some real cases to know, whether you do have an ability to define a problem, break it down, and set priorities. So you'll be given one or more cases that test what you've learned, which is why we see this as being not something that just is a course that starts and finishes. You really have the opportunity to do this as a sort of as a lifelong pursuit. And you don't really need much. I have a little moleskin notebook, and I have a big art pad, and I do my logic trees and problem definitions and prioritizations that way, or with a team on a whiteboard and the different ventures that I'm involved in. But there's an expression that to be really good at something, you need to have done 10,000 hours. Whether it's with a concert pianist or somebody with the cello. But I think that rule of that it's linked to the psychologist Erickson. But I think 10,000 hours is probably right to be a great problem solver as well.
So it's something that you can learn, that you can pick up. It's not something that you're always just going to know. And so what ages are the best ways to sort of start learning problem solving, or start even defining how you understand it?
Well, I think what we've been quite taken by at Sydney University with St Andrews College is that the undergraduates are doing a problem solving course, but they're choosing a societal problem or a business problem relating to a venture, and then they're actually going through the 7 steps process to solve the problem. And they're in teams of 3. So 2 other people critique your work, and then you critique their work to end up with a better solution. So we like that. We like that model of learning by doing, and having not just working on Dina's problem or Rob's problem, but working on a problem that they're really passionate about and that they would like to see solved. The other side of this that we're quite excited about is conversations that we've had with a few people that this might even be extended into high school.
Okay.
We would love to see that opportunity for things like environmental problems like water quality in the local river, or one educator he feels that problems like space junk, that students in high school could do a pretty good job at defining that problem, breaking it down, and coming up with recommendations for how we limit what could be a very significant problem in the future.
And how can that skill set also set you apart from other people also applying for a job, for example, or looking into advance their career a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the examples that we use in Bulletproof Problem Solving is a problem I used to apply to when I was heading recruiting at McKinsey. And the problem was, is Sydney Airport running out of capacity? And we would offer that problem to potential recruits and give them 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and then they could get up at the whiteboard or just talk about how would they define and how would they break apart that problem. So we looked to see whether they had a logical structure. We looked to see how well they presented it and how complete it was. That process is something you can apply all the time. And the more problems you work on, the more you try putting your own logic trees together on your little moleskin notebook or or whatever it might be,
Mm-hmm.
the better and the more confident you're going to get.
Yeah. And I see that talking about moleskin, talking about noting things down and jotting things out, how is that different from, for example, the use of AI and the use of technology that has been advancing in terms of one, productivity, and also the skill set of problem solving?
Um, well, we're quite excited about AI and its potential, and in the Imperfectionists, we talk about a couple of examples. One is a McKinsey team that were working on trying to develop new products in what are called super hard materials, which is more than 40 gigapascals. And this team used an AI approach where they looked up all of the patents and citations relating to the technology in those areas. But one of the expressions I love is that they were able to do 5,000 expert calls in a minute. So extraordinary productivity in sifting through literature, documents, that just cause you to say, you can think very differently about both the insight you get and then, of course, the productivity. But one of my favourite stories is one that comes from the Nature Conservancy, where I'm involved as a trustee. And the Nature Conservancy is concerned about overfishing of the oceans and the loss of species, particularly in Asia Pacific, like tuna. And it's unregulated. And what we felt would make a big difference would be if you could have on the back of a fishing boat a camera, and then able to fit it with AI, and then figure out, with all of that splash of water and rocking of the boat and so forth, what species were being landed, and in what quantities. And so, like a lot of people, the Nature Conservancy said, well, we're a conservation organisation, we're not an IT group. So they went the path of saying, could we crowdsource a solution? So they put it up on Kaggle, which is an Australian company that was bought by Google, and they have prizes and competitions, and they offered a $150,000 prize for the algorithm that did the best job of identifying the fish species. 2,293 teams competed for the 150,000. Yeah. They truly tapped into the world's capability to solve that problem, and they got down to a final group of 5 or 10, and now have the AI fitted on with a camera on an Indonesian fishing boat, and they're getting something like 90 to 95% accuracy.
Wow!
So we're seeing just ways to look at problems very differently. And the final example I'll give is a German example where in dermatology, where they asked 157 dermatologists to determine whether or not a melanoma was cancerous or not. And the AI outperformed all 157 of the surgeons, the dermatologists.
Okay.
So we've got this ability to work, together with AI. I think we could be on the cusp of a productivity set of breakthroughs in the years ahead when you marry human capability and AI.
And how has AI? I mean, there are a lot of debates when it comes to AI, especially when it comes to the lack of a skill set now of problem solving, because pretty much technology does it for you and AI can now do it for you. So why would you get a person to do it if you can get an AI to do it? So what are your thoughts on the overuse of technology when it comes to problem solving and productivity?
I think it's in some respects almost like too early to tell.
Yeah. Okay.
But I like these examples that I've given you of the experimentation that is occurring. Even that last example, we're not going to do away with dermatologists, I don't think. There's a very important personal touch that comes with it. But I could certainly see next time, I go to a dermatologist, if not next time, in a year from now, where the dermatologist is linked up to the data set that AI has trained on, and I become in even better hands.
Yeah. I think, especially when it comes to my point of view, I know when I'm talking with my granddad, for example, we're talking about the use of technology all the time. And we always have this kind of debate where it comes to people are using it far too much. It's upgrading faster than a person's mind can sort of develop and understand it. So how are we ever going to, do you think that we're ever going to be able to balance the use of using our own brains and also relying on technology as well?
Well, I'm much more positive and confident that you are. There'll be some false starts, as there'll be some overstatements of the impact, but I think we're seeing enough glimmers early on to say we could diagnose a whole lot of illness earlier and save lives, and we could make far better use of our data than we do today in companies. So a lot of positive to work with here.
And so going back to our use of problem solving and our use of the skill sets, I know that you have some tips and you have some tricks as to how we can refine our own problem solving skills. So can you share with us and with our audience some of the ways that you've learnt and you've sort of understood to be the ways to refine our own problem solving?
I think I have to start with a problem definition, and one of my colleagues, Michael Trail, who was the CEO of SVA, used the expression a lot. What does good look like? Or what does success look like? So that's another way of saying, if we solve the problem, what would the world be like? And then testing that with your team and with your superiors and so on, is a very, very sensible way of feeling like that you've got the right problem scope. Then this notion of that I've given several examples of you just can't solve a problem like obesity or loss of market share at the highest level without breaking that problem down. So, for example, if it's a problem of loss of market share, is it a problem of price? Is it a problem of product features? Is it something to do with our service levels or warranty? So that's an example of breaking a problem down. So you've got to get experienced and practiced at how you break a problem into its component parts. The part that I think is often missed that is terribly important is coming up with some priorities, because you just can't solve everything, in 6 or 8 weeks or a month. You've got to make some choices about what you're going to spend your time on. And we use a little matrix that shows how big is the impact and how likely is it that something can happen. And so it's a little bit like that Stephen Covey who used to say from 7 Habits for Highly Effective People, first things first. Do the things that are high impact and have high probability of success. Worry about the low impact and low probability last. And then these notions we've talked about before of making sure that a work plan, does integrate the work of different people. Getting good at being able to do lots of back of the envelope calculations, using a few little tips like, is there an 80-20 going on here? Can I figure out where the break-even point is? there's a whole lot of things you can do that take you a long way to solving a problem without having to do a very large Monte Carlo simulation or complex scenario analysis. And you save those tools, we call them the big guns, for the very, very big problems. And then these final steps of synthesizing and recommending action, that's where your debating skills and your ability to convince people and, show them how exciting a future can be when you take a course of action. Practice makes perfect with that.
Yes. And no, I think it's really interesting when you're talking about the different practices, because there's so many different ways that a person can sort of improve their problem solving and sort of understand it a little bit more. But those tips definitely seem like a very, very small, a very defined way of improving it a whole lot more, which is very interesting to me. Now, I would love to hear your own way of problem solving. And in our practice and habit section, we have this question that we ask everyone as, what is your practice in order to improve and cultivate your own problem solving skills?
I have to confess to being old school with having a pen and a piece of paper. I have tried some of the online techniques for drawing trees and trying to do systems change and causality and so on, but I'm just not very good at that. So I stick to what I know and what I'm used to doing. But I think at any point in time, there's probably 2 or 3 problems I'm thinking about, and then invariably, putting pen to paper, and then crossing things out as I learn a little bit more. So in many respects, what I didn't say before was that this whole idea of running through step by step is important, but iterating and going back and forth is really quite important. So if I learn some new facts, as I was telling you before about bushfires and efforts to quell these mega fires, those facts then cause me, in some cases, to redefine the problem. And that happens a lot, and that's an extraordinarily enjoyable part of the problem solving process. The other thing I do that I joke about with my wife Paula is we have a team of 2. Where I put my arguments and explain my logic on a particular issue to her and say, "What do you think?" And she's able to punch great holes in things that don't stand muster. But whether it's your wife, your partner, or a friend, or whatever, when I say problem solving is a team sport, but you get enormous value by testing these ideas, sharing facts with others as part of the process, rather than it being a solo endeavour.
And what are some of the challenges that sort of take place when you're discussing it with either your wife or a colleague? What are some of the challenges that you've faced?
Well, we the biggest one, I think, is we like to define a problem and turn that problem into a hypothesis, and that's and that's good. That's an important part of the process, because as part of the scientific method, you then test the hypothesis. But sometimes we don't. Sometimes we just set out to collect the facts that fit the argument for the hypothesis.
Yep.
And that's a human weakness, and I'm guilty of it, as I'm sure a lot of other problem solvers are. But yeah, you have to guard against that and try to be open-minded to the fact that you're going to turn some facts over that are going to really cause you to say, I didn't get that right. Therefore, the hypothesis has to change.
So when arguing your case a little bit more, when sort of figuring out who's, for lack of a better phrase, right or wrong, how do you sort of settle the debate or the argument as to who's the right one in each scenario?
I think that can be done in a number of different ways, but it's quite you touch on quite an important part of the process where you have that opportunity within the team to say, well, how do these things sound? Is this robust? Is it going to be true in the next recession as strongly as it was in the last boom, or whatever those changes in scenarios may be? So, it's a process of persuasion, and you hope that everybody's got their heart in the right place to support what the strongest argument is.
And how do you separate the emotional aspect of it, either the ego or the vulnerability that could take place when someone argues that your case isn't strong enough or that your reasoning isn't correct?
I think the way we used to have an expression of in McKinsey that we support what's right rather than who's right, and that touches on a little bit earlier what we talked about before the show, that sort of looking for the truth and the facts that are supported by it. That's a culture you've got to have, and sometimes the expression is used, play the ball, not the man, which of course, being coming from an AFL background, I like a lot, but I found at times it surprised me, in a university setting that, sometimes there were, I would see personal put downs that had nothing to do with the strength of the argument. But you've got to create a team culture, where, the search is for the truth and what's right. And therefore, it's not part of the process to be attacking an individual, on personal grounds.
Well, that is a very interesting way of looking at it, especially when you said, I think you were talking about the man earlier, the phrase, and I think that is a very interesting phrase because, I'm sorry, what was the phrase? The phrase that you were saying earlier? Not the man.
Play the ball, not the man.
Play the ball, not the man. Yes. For me, my father's side is a very big AFL watcher. He's very big sports fan. So I think that really would hit for me as well when it comes to play the ball, because it's a situation of you playing the game, not the person that you're playing as well. And I think when you're talking about ego, like we were talking about before, there's a lot of things that you're having to sort of realize when understanding that you're not really going against the person, you're going against that person's situation or that person's problem. So it's a really difficult thing to sort of separate between, you're not against the person, you're against either what they're doing or what they understand. Yeah.
I mean, a slight variant on this is at McKinsey, one of the expressions we used to use was that every consultant had an obligation to dissent. An obligation to dissent.
Yeah.
And that was fantastic for, having the junior people on the team feel that they had a voice and they could contribute. But it's an unusual expression. You don't see it very often, but it was very much designed, to say it's okay to disagree, and we'll work it out from there.
And why do you think a lot of people are just not wanting to disagree or not wanting to, especially when it comes to a hierarchy, the hierarchy when it comes to a workplace environment. There are people that just not wanting to be honest and say things and say how they feel about the company.
Well, it's hard at times to disagree.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard for that one person, on a board of 10 or in a senior management group of 10, to have a view that's out in left field and everybody else is somewhere else. So there's a lot of pressures we have to conform and to agree.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get into those situations, all you can do is do your best to point out the cost of being wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And if the cost of being wrong, that is that, you go down a path, that has financial implications that could be disastrous.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've convinced yourself, that is the case and that there's a reasonable prospect of that happening, then you've got to be guided by your problem solving to dissent, and to carry that view as forcefully as you can.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've all had that experience in our lives, and we're better off rather than just feeling, I'd just go along with it, or I just keep quiet on this one.
Mm-hmm.
You may do that in 9 out of 10 situations, but there's going to be the ones where if you've thought hard about it and thought through the consequences, and if they are as significant as you think they are, then you owe it to yourself to argue that case strongly.
Mm-hmm. And this ties in really well with some of our audience questions that have been sent over to us. There are quite a few. Some of them have been spoken about throughout the show, but there are some that I think are really interesting and definitely I think could use your opinion. So the first one is, how can problem-solving skills be applied to complex and even ambiguous situations in order to achieve a goal?
I've given a couple of examples. The first thing I'd say is, neither my co-author nor myself are experts with social problems, but we wrote a book in Bulletproof Problem Solving. We wrote a chapter on wicked problems,
mm-hmm.
and that's when we took the example of obesity as an illustration, and the HIV example. So we feel that we've been able to demonstrate or to show
mm-hmm.
that problem solving can throw light on even the most complex or wicked problems.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a whole lot of issues in the world, like climate. We would feel that certainly lends itself to problem solving capability, and we're seeing some excellent problem solving capability on that side. But when it comes to issues of inequality and justice and so on, we don't lay any particular claims that we can add great value there, because they relate so much to values and different judgments that are somewhat separate from the process that we feel comfortable working with.
Okay, perfect. Now, how can our thinking be leveraged to promote better problem solving and productivity?
I think my answer is a fairly humble one, in that I think over a generation, if we had if problem solving was part of a school curriculum and a university/college curriculum, mm-hmm. I think we'd have better levels of debate on a lot of issues, and I think companies would perform better. But we're trying to solve this somewhat differently. We're trying to solve it, one person at a time, mm-hmm. and to have these conversations with students that we talk to, with colleges that are adopting our curriculum. I got a lovely note today from a young guy who'd been at McKinsey who's got a startup in AI, and he said how much he was influenced by reading Bulletproof Problem Solving.
Oh, wow.
So that's why I feel it's one life at a time, and every time I gave a workshop in Melbourne a couple of years ago with a group of not-for-profit leaders, and a woman wrote to me afterwards and talked about how she had a situation with a disabled son and his living arrangements, and she worked through bulletproof problem solving and found a solution that was a great solution for her and her son, and thanked me for it. Now I can only thank her, but it was just so wonderful to hear, that even in a situation like that, where what looked like a problem without a solution turned out to be one that this lady was able to solve, with the support of our framework.
Wow. It's amazing just how much the steps that included in the book and the theories and the understanding that is defined in your book as well can be used and implemented so well into a very specific situation and just taken into a context that can be used to really help a situation. Yeah. The last one is, how can I improve my focus so I can increase my productivity and also solve problems more efficiently while also maintaining a high quality result?
That's a big order.
Yes.
And my suggestions are not grand, but I do think taking your 2 or 3 biggest issues that you've got, and then just start with the first of them, and start putting together a good definition of the problem and doing the breakdown of it and prioritizing, and then feeling confident that you've done some analysis and brought some insight with some new facts or some experiments that you might try that take you that step further. So it's not going to happen all in one go, but over a period of time. And once you've tackled the first one, and then the next 2 or 3, and then the next 20 over the next decade, you're going to feel very confident about your ability, to solve issues that come your way.
Yeah, when I saw that question, I definitely thought that could use a breakdown as to what was the most important aspects that you're wanting to talk about, because there is a lot. And I think that's pretty much the question of our entire life as a whole, as to how can I improve while also maintaining a high result in everything, in every aspect of life. It is definitely not the easiest kind of question that we have on the show.
Can I just say what I hadn't mentioned before is that what we've been surprised about recently is that the World Economic Forum lists the most important skills that companies are looking for. And the number one skill for a number of years now has been complex problem solving. So we've got a situation where employers, and we would say business and government alike, are saying they value problem solving. That they want to see more people with problem solving skills. So the people who are asking you these questions, they're running with the tide. That problem solving is being viewed as important, and therefore it becomes important to be as good a problem solver as you can be.
No, I think it's really interesting in the aspect of business and aspect of also trying to find employees into a company. And I think especially when determining the amount of problem solving skills that each of the employers have, especially when it comes to the higher management, if they don't have that skill set, it greatly sort of impacts the lower workers and everyone who's working in a sort of a hierarchy. Now, I would love to give you the open mic. Now, this is a section that our audience knows really well, where it gives the guests a chance to talk about anything that you are passionate about or something that you're working on recently. So in the last few minutes, I'd love to give you the floor. And yes, please share with our audience what you'd like to.
The first thing that comes to mind is something that I've been involved in for a couple of decades now, and that's my work as a trustee of the Nature Conservancy, which is a global organisation that protects the lands and waters on which all life depends. And I was attracted to the Nature Conservancy because they were science-based and collaborative, and very much they were born when they were a group of ecologists that was going to have a forest cut down. So their response was, let's get the money and buy the forest. So they used a market mechanism to address the problem, and that forest still continues to this day in New York. Fast forward to today, and a group of us have just protected 44,000 hectares of rainforest in Borneo, in Kalimantan, which is an extraordinary carbon store and biodiversity with the orangutan. And we've done a set of arrangements with local villagers who are able to continue their livelihoods with low impact logging, but to preserve this rainforest. So this whole notion of the Nature Conservancy being problem solvers for the environment is one of these things that it's a passion, but every day with what we do to achieve the 2030 goals for Australia with climate and biodiversity, we have new challenges to figure out, using our best problem solving skills, how we do it and how we go about it. So I guess what I wanted just to convey with that personal story is, these you can get better at business problems and using AI and market share and new products and so on, but you can get enormous pleasure and satisfaction in being able to solve some of the biggest problems we have in the world as a problem solver.
Oh, that's amazing. And especially with the work of saving a lot of the parts of the rainforest that, if not for that conservancy, then definitely the next generation or the generation after us wouldn't get to enjoy, wouldn't get to participate in saving. So that is remarkable work on your part. And I hope that our generation is just uses our importance as just as much as you have so far. And it's amazing to see that the generation before us is just able to think ahead a lot more than our generation is currently. So yes, I definitely hope that there is a whole lot of the rainforest that we're still able to see for years to come.
I do too. Thank you, Dina.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robert, for joining me and for being a part of the show and helping me actually define what problem solving is. And I think you have probably actually defined it for me. So I'm really glad to hear that. If there is a way that audience member would like to get in touch with you, is there a particular method that you would prefer?
You can find me through LinkedIn.
Okay, perfect. I will have the LinkedIn link down below in order for easy access for our audience members. So thank you, Robert, so much for joining me once again. If you guys want to see the next episode, it will either be me or a new host coming onto the show. So yes, thank you guys so much for joining me, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.
You have been listening to Work in Progress, the Personal Productivity Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps others find us and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at pp.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Tia Harmer. Thanks for tuning in.